God damn Elizabethan times.
I know. Like, come on.
I'm sure it was all going on though.
Oh, it absolutely was. It absolutely was.
Hello everyone and welcome to Intimacy 360. I'm Ian West, your host, and I'm so thrilled to have you here. Join me on this journey whilst we look at intimacy in TV, film and theatre. Rachel Heyburn has directed the world-famous collective Pussy Riot at the closing evening of Banksy's Disneyland. She recently worked as the Associate Director of the UK tour of Fatal Attraction and the Associate Director of the National Tour of Full Monty, and is currently doing her PhD in Shakespeare Studies. Better 3 hours too soon than 1 minute too late. The always on time, Rachel Heyburn. Rachel Heyburn, welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is brilliant.
Oh, you're welcome. Right, should we dive straight in?
Yes, please.
Okay. I would love to know, because I'm so excited to have Dr. Shakespeare sitting on the on the sofa
Almost.
today. Almost. And I'd love to know, in historical context of looking at consent and boundaries and intimacy in Elizabethan England.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Just jump in with a big question.
Straight for it.
Yeah.
So just to give you a bit of context to the work of Shakespeare and what we're dealing with, it's a really different time to the one that we're dealing with now. So in Elizabethan England, the age of marriage for girls is 12. And 12. And the age for boys is 14. Now, typically, unless you're from an aristocratic I know,
sorry,
mad.
I never knew that, and that's just blown my mind.
It's absolutely mad. So
and horrific.
It's awful. But so if you're dealing with sort of like normal people, everyday sort of middle class or working class people, they typically wouldn't get married until they were in their like late teens, early 20s. But if you're from an aristocratic family, that's much younger. And that's for power, money, status,
privilege,
securing of dynasties, all of that kind of stuff.
Wow.
Within that, there is a sort of unwritten rule that particularly for young girls, that the marriage won't be consummated until she has completed puberty. It's not written down anywhere.
Okay.
But there is a sort of
unwritten
agreement that would happen. So an example of when this didn't happen was Henry VIII's grandmother Margaret Beaufort was 12 years old when she got married and 13 when she had Henry VII. 13. But
wow.
even I know it's mad, isn't it? But even then,
oh my God.
There's documentation around it where people were clearly very shocked and were clearly very unhappy that this had happened to her.
Okay.
So legally allowed to get married, but would wait. Still far too young, and not remotely okay. But that's sort of the context that we're dealing with. It's just an incredibly different time.
Wow.
So you can see examples of that throughout Shakespeare's work. So in Romeo and Juliet, for example, Juliet's 13 at the beginning of the play. She turns 14 in the play. And Romeo is obviously much older than her. By modern day standards, that's really problematic and really difficult.
Yes.
And actually, I've taught Romeo and Juliet to high school students quite a few times. And when I was looking at it as a year 9 myself, I'm like an elder millennial. I had the Romeo and Juliet Baz Luhrmann film had just came out. I thought it was the most romantic thing that you could possibly imagine.
And it's Baz Luhrmann, it all looks
it's Leonardo
beautiful
DiCaprio and it's modern day and it's all
yes.
very lovely. When I was teaching it recently, about a year and a half ago, the first thing that all my like year 9s did was put their hands up and just went, Romeo gives like really big red flag energy, and listed all the reasons why.
Wow.
It was like, Miss, did you know that she's only 13 in the play? And I was like, great. The generations are saved.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a difference.
Yeah, such a difference.
Looking from such a different perspective. I actually can't believe that actually the age of consent was 13. 12.
Yeah.
But then they said puberty. But that's very, very...
And you're completely at the mercy of the person who you've married. They may or may not pay attention to that. And that is absolutely up to the man that you have married. There's other stuff that's going on in Elizabethan England, particularly within relation to the world of theatre, which is, again, sorry, I'm getting on to all the dark stuff.
Yeah, we've got all the dark stuff out
of the way, and I'll move on to the more positives later. In Elizabethan England, it is completely legal for children to be kidnapped, to be put into apprentices to work on stage. So there isn't...
Whoa. Rewind. It was perfectly legal to kidnap children to basically put them on stage.
Yeah, put them to work on stage.
To put them to work.
Yeah, so women aren't allowed on stage during this period.
Yes.
Most of the female roles are played by really young teenage boys.
Yes.
They can, so that they can feminize them as much as is humanly possible. They haven't been through puberty. They don't have, you know, the shadow and the features and all of that kind of stuff. So that's typically what was going on. And there is documentation to prove that Elizabeth I had sanctioned and legalized child kidnap. So there are documents. There's parents who've tried to get their children back after this has happened to them, and they failed.
And they didn't succeed.
Yeah, and they didn't succeed.
That's horrific.
Yeah. So this is like the context of what we're doing.
And that was legalised.
Yeah, it was legal.
Legal to kidnap children and put them to work in theatre.
Yeah.
And these children never got to go home to their parents.
Yeah.
And were never given any consent to be taken away in the first place.
No, and it's quite interesting who was being kidnapped as well. They're often quite middle-class boys because they're being taught verse at school, so they'd be able to speak it and to perform it.
So that's interesting. So the actual class levels, where historically a lot of stuff would have happened to maybe lower class.
Yeah.
You know,
you consider the most vulnerable. Right?
Vulnerable would be the easiest to cover up and hide, and you know, and that is, it's been historically, you know. So interesting, they wasn't, because they actually came with vocabulary, maybe some understanding.
They could read possibly, and the rhythms of the speech and how to perform it. They would have a sort of basic knowledge of that going into their sort of unchosen careers. But yes, that existed.
Well, thankfully, we're living in very, very different times. Thankfully, I just can't even fathom that, to be honest. I'm going to have to really go back and unpack this and think a little bit more about what you've just said, because it's so deep. But thankfully, we live in very, very different times. Can you tell me, though, is there any challenges that you've seen in Shakespeare's work regarding maybe intimacy and consent, actually based in the text? Or
so I think Romeo and Juliet, by modern day standards, is a great example of that. Juliet goes from being 13 to turning 14 in the play. It's assumed and understood that Romeo is older than her, late teens, early 20s, sort of at the earliest. That's difficult.
Yes.
And within that, we understand that Romeo at the very beginning of the play has fallen in love with a woman called Rosalind, and it's inferred that he's slept with her. He claims that he's completely obsessed with her, absolutely in love with her at the very beginning of the play, and then he sees Juliet, and immediately we never hear of Rosalind again.
Wow.
You know, she's never seen in the play, never spoken of again. He's completely obsessional about Juliet. So there is a really interesting... Who's 13, yeah. So within that, there is a bit of an argument that maybe Romeo is somebody who, what we would call by modern day standards, fetishizes purity and innocence. Once he's had Rosalind, he's not interested in her anymore. No longer
innocent, therefore... Wow.
We move on. Would he, if the ending wasn't the ending, would he continue doing this?
Would there be somebody else would have? Juliet been pushed to the side and...
Yeah.
Wow.
Another good example is Measure for Measure. When Isabella, who's a nun, is trying to save the life of her brother and negotiate for his release from prison, Angelo basically says that if you do X, Y, and Z for me, sexually, I'll do something for you. She ends up turning him down. She refuses, and there are other means, and the play works out, and it's all fine. But it's an attempt. It's by modern day standards, it's an attempted rape.
Wow. It's interesting to think. We'll touch on this a little bit later, but I think it's interesting to see how these issues are now tackled in modern day productions of Shakespeare. We'll maybe discuss that a little bit later on. Hi, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Don't forget, you can follow me on Instagram and also on the old tickety-tock. If you don't want to see this face, but you just want to hear my gorgeous voice and grab some intimacy on the go, you can get the extended audio version by following the links below. Be interested to get your view on this. In modern day plays and musicals, do you think like the subject matter we hear so often in modern day plays and musicals actually was prevalent in Shakespeare's work?
Yes.
But a lot of times maybe we haven't seen it or we didn't label it, because you know, even now we're only just, you know, musicals and plays are tackling some real heavy subject matter. And like you say, with Shakespeare,
there's that saying, isn't there? I can't remember where it comes from, that there's only actually 6 original stories in the world.
And the rest is...
And we build and grow on all of those stories. Like Shakespeare, like a lot of Shakespeare's plays aren't actually original. You can trace Romeo and Juliet back to all sorts of, Saxon fairy
Before.
tales,
Yes.
all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm just wondering if there is maybe 6 original stories in the world and we've just built on it from there.
And do you feel like in modern day musicals, or I'm talking about musicals or plays, we may tackle things like mental health issues. Do you see stuff like that prevalent in Shakespeare's
All
work?
over it, I think.
Okay.
So this is something that I really love, delving into and discussing. There is obviously within Elizabethan era and Shakespeare's time no official kind of diagnosis or names that we can put to anything. But Shakespeare's certainly seeing what's around
still
him.
only in recent years. We're only just now hearing about this.
And we're still not brilliant at understanding things or
it's
being
so
able
multifaceted
to use,
and it's ever the landscape of mental health is changing all the time.
Completely.
Because we are open and we are trying to learn and we're trying to be aware of these things and acknowledge and not just hide, and therefore we are talking about it more, which is wonderful. Where obviously in Shakespearean time there would have been no discussion.
There's no discussion, there's no help, there's no diagnosis, there's no ability to even understand what's going on with yourself if this is something that is happening to you.
No awareness of that.
But Shakespeare is seeing it. He's clearly looking and watching and seeing what's going on with people and recognizing things. So if you take Macbeth as an example, we've got Macbeth is a decorated war hero.
Yes.
And he ends up murdering King Duncan. And there's other stuff that goes along in that play, and it's really dark. And it's basically the descent of a powerful man into madness and to nothingness, basically. If we take just the understanding that Macbeth is a decorated war hero with all the things that we know about war now, you've got in the Vietnam War and World War II, you would say that it was shell shock. We would now call it PTSD.
Yes.
I think it's kind of quite unfathomable to think that Macbeth doesn't have PTSD. And that might be governing the reason why he makes some of his decisions. He decides to kill Duncan very quickly. And this might be trauma responses. This might be not being able to cope with his environment, not being able to come back from war, not being able to understand the things that he's seen. In a time when there's no explanation of that, no conversation around that, no help.
It's incredible, isn't it, that, these moments in our lives that, now with the moments in our lives that can define us, but also that we can be suffering from mental health, all these different elements in life. And now we are so fortunate. Yeah. So fortunate. Yeah. The one that you even know what the word mental health is and you're able to Google it. Yeah. Look into, although Google is never a good thing when you're looking into mental health.
No, but it's a starting point for most people.
Yeah,
right?
But so there's tools out there to help us deal, with things. And
Hamlet's another great example as well. Hamlet has also got a reputation for doing not very good things to the people involved in those productions because it's such a dark play and the themes that it explores. Obviously, Hamlet has lost his father. His father's dead. He suspects that his uncle has murdered his father. His uncle has now married his mother. There is a whole load of stuff going on in Hamlet, and he sees the ghost of his dead father. By modern day standards, if you were to look at it and try and diagnose it, with some of the things like the hallucinations and the way that he uses verse, he goes in and out of verse and prose a lot, which is quite rare. We would possibly say that he had something like bipolar 2.
There you go.
Where you hallucinate and you can't, and you have those manic episodes and then you have those depressive episodes as well. When you have something like Hamlet, we've had actors be very vocal about the problems that they've had in performing Hamlet and being able to hold it and sustain it for that period of time and that intensity. Daniel Day-Lewis has spoken very openly about it when he did it. I think he did it at the National. He said that he saw the ghost of his own father who'd passed away and ended up having a really bad mental health episode and taking a very long gap from acting after it.
This is where self-care in our industry is so important.
So important. Buzz Goodbody, who features quite heavily in my PhD, she was the first female director at the RSC and she was the first artistic director of The Other Place, which is their venue just down the road from the RSC. She ended up taking her own life on the press night of her Hamlet. And there is evidence or conversation around whether her directing Hamlet had something to do with her decision to do that.
Wow. On the opening night. That's quite something.
Yeah.
That's awful. It's such a shame. And this, once again, the self-care, looking after yourself. When you're having to go there as an actor, regardless if it's intimacy or it's insular or whatever it may be, this self-care and commitment to looking after self
Completely.
is so important.
And I think sometimes with Shakespeare, people think that it's hundreds of years old and it's written in verse. So obviously there's those levels of distance, and you couldn't possibly be affected in the same way as doing, a modern play at the Royal Court or at the National or something like that. It's still very much there. You're getting into these really difficult themes. You're living it. They're very long plays often as well. So to sustain them.
But beautifully emotional. Of course. I mean, it's funny, you've only got to hear Judi Dench do like a sonnet and you go, woof.
Yeah. Her Lady Macbeth at the other place in the 1970s is like legendary. She's just amazing.
And, it's so emotionally charged. But you said interesting about modern day, so looking at Shakespeare modern day productions, obviously there's loads of modern day productions with Shakespeare and really tackled and flipping genders and all these other wonderful things that are happening. And what's your view on that? How do you think intimate?
I think it's brilliant.
Oh, you think it's brilliant?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. Yeah, make them as modern as possible, bring them up to date.
Brilliant.
Particularly get young audiences.
I was going to say, because you're going to lose your audiences as well if we don't move with the times. Of course, we want to keep these wonderful, great works, and but also we've got to make them accessible. Otherwise, we lose them.
I mean, how many people when they were 14 and sitting down with Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth for the first time just went, God, this is really.
You go, no.
I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
Which is definitely the way I came in. I didn't understand it. I don't think I was taught it particularly well. I definitely didn't have that kind of passion. It was only when I was starting to be interviewed, it's a bit of a confession, starting to be interviewed for big Shakespeare venues as an assistant director, that I was like, oh, wow.
I need to know.
I need to sit down and and then it completely ignited something and
which is
fell
amazing.
in love with it.
It's interesting because I look back in my career and go, okay, how much Shakespeare have I ever had to do or I've been asked to do? And I look and go, I remember at college doing Shakespeare, but I was at dance college. Yeah. We did drama. We did snippets of,
the monologues sort of here and
absolutely.
there. Yeah.
Producer, all these things. I don't know. But
one of the productions that I would love to sort of highlight in a really positive way, because I've talked about a lot of dark stuff.
Yes.
So in the positive way is Ola Ince's production of Romeo and Juliet at the Globe. I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago. It's a really interesting, it was beautiful, beautiful production and really modern in lots of ways. She had trigger warnings running throughout it.
Okay, throughout the production. Visually.
So they were visually. So she had basically a digital board, and every now and again it would come up with facts. So you would have brain facts about teenagers.
Okay.
Teenagers aren't, something I'm paraphrasing, but teenagers aren't able to regulate their emotions because their prefrontal cortex won't develop until the age of 25.
Yes.
And it just gives you little moments of why are these people making these decisions?
Yes.
Why are they doing the things that they're doing? There was a percentage about how many teenagers end up taking their own lives. There was percentages about familial violence within the home. Juliet's father is an absolute tyrant. There's and knife crime, because obviously, there's a lot of murder in Romeo and Juliet. And this punctuated the performance the whole way through, and it just completely flips it on its head and gets you thinking about it in a different way. Of course, these people are making the decisions that they're making because their brains simply aren't developed. Romeo and Juliet are set over a very short amount of time. There's no thinking time. There's no gap to go, what am I doing?
Yes.
And there's no grown-ups that are giving any proper advice. There's the nurse is the only
She shines a light on a very practical element of going, okay, this is why A, B, and C is happening, rather than us always going, looking for the reasoning within the plot. Actually, it can be a lot to do with biology and all these other things, all these wonderful stuff.
When puberty hits, your hormones go nuts, and like there's sort of like percentages around that, and there's facts around that, which she really highlighted throughout the production, which was just brilliant, and it gave a completely different reading to that play.
Okay, so with this, have you seen this on stage where you've actually seen this stage with simulated sex, or is it always done like implied?
It's always been implied, so you wouldn't be able to put simulated sex on stage in the Elizabethan era, so it's not sort of ever explicitly written.
But in a modern day production,
I haven't seen it, but I'm sure it has been.
Yeah, because I just wondered, because I always feel like in Shakespeare, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm definitely not Dr. Shakespeare, that anytime I've seen Shakespeare, when it's come to intimacy, a lot of it's been very implied.
Yes, it is.
It's very implied, very charged emotionally, or there's a connection, but not visually seen hundreds.
No, I haven't seen it. So in the Nicholas Heitner version of Midsummer Night's Dream at the bridge, it was definitely more inferred, and there was some lovely looks between each other of like, oh, well, yeah, that happened. I would love to, or I don't have tickets for it, unfortunately, but I'd love to see the Romeo and Juliet that's in the West End at the moment, the Jamie Lloyd production. I wonder if there
very
is...
modern production of that. It'd be interesting. Yeah, I'd like to see that as well.
Because that's the other obvious one, because it's very clear that they do have sex to consummate their marriage. It's just that in all the productions I've seen of it, it's always off stage, it's always implied.
Be interesting to actually I'd like to see that as well. Be interesting to see if that has been played out in slightly a different way and a more modern approach to it.
I would love to see it though,
I would as well.
That's really important.
What's your favourite intimacy moment? A moment of intimacy, or it could be simulated sex, whatever it may be, in Shakespeare that you've seen, like a classic to a modern day. Have you seen, if you can think of maybe... If you can think of maybe a modern day production or a classic or either.
So one of my favourite things and one of my favourite plays, Shakespeare plays in the world, is As You Like It.
Okay.
It's a comedy. It's beautiful. It's mostly set outdoors. Outdoor theatre companies do it all the time. One of the reasons why I particularly love that is because I'm absolutely convinced that Rosalind is transgender, and it's quite a beautiful celebration of that.
Wonderful.
There's lots of LGBTQ running throughout As You Like It. Celia, describes Rosalind at the very beginning of the play, they're cousins, as she describes them as Juno's swans. So Juno is the god of love, and swans mate for life. She's almost certainly completely in love with Rosalind, but obviously they can't do anything about it or be together. And then when Rosalind later falls in love with Orlando... God
damn Elizabethan times.
I know. Come on.
I'm sure it was all going on though.
Oh, it absolutely was. It absolutely was. But Celia, when Rosalind falls in love with Orlando, Celia goes silent from that point onwards. It's quite a difficult character for an actor to play because she's always on stage, but she says very little throughout the majority of the play, and I'm very convinced it's because she's completely in love with Rosalind and she can't do anything about it, and she's watching her fall in love with someone else.
Oh, that's heartbreaking,
isn't it? But then we've got Rosalind, who, when she goes into the Forest of Arden, is dressed as a man. She's dressed as a sort of a teenage boy. She calls herself Ganymede. She meets Orlando. I'm using she pronouns simply because she does go back to being female at the end. I don't think she wants to.
Yes.
But that's my sneaky interpretation of it. She falls in love with Orlando when she's dressed as a boy. And she, by being Ganymede, she has financial freedom. She has independence. She can do what she wants. She can fall in love. There is almost certainly a moment when the two of them are alone that they're very intimate. Some productions have them kissing.
Okay.
When I directed it, I had them kissing as well. And it feels really important that that's in there. Orlando falls in love with Rosalind when she's Ganymede.
Oh.
Isn't that gorgeous?
It is. It's beautiful.
Yeah. She ends up sacrificing her Ganymede self so that she can end up marrying Orlando at the end. So she goes back to being Rosalind in order to marry Orlando, which is the problematic part of that, because I don't think she wants to. I think that she would be Ganymede forever.
Oh, that's That's a shame,
isn't it? But there's the Elizabethan context for you. But it's just such a beautiful exploration of like LGBTQ.
Rachel Heyburn, as Julius Caesar said, I'm going to get this right.
Amazing.
I thank you for your pain and your courtesy. There you go. I had to look down that quote then.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. It's been an absolute joy.
Me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, lovely people. Make sure you subscribe and like and press that notification bell to keep up to date with all future episodes.